it turns out that Eisenhower, of all people, was quite prophetic about where we were headed. Remember that the highest tax rates for the wealthiest individuals and corporations under the Eisenhower administration was 91%. I mean, people say, well, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to, I say, tax them. We're going to tax them at 91%, like we used to. And the other thing we're going to do is, we must do, is destroy the military machine in this country, which is the greatest enemy of democracy. There's no rational, was it yesterday, right? Was the 17th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan? I mean, this is our micro-militarism. The Taliban controls more territory in Afghanistan than when we went in. They do. And we've lost the war. American troops, they don't even want to go out with the Afghan army because half of them are Taliban. I was with the PKK once when I was covering the Middle East. This is the Kurdish separatist group. And I've been with a lot of rebel or insurgencies, and I covered the war in El Salvador for 5 years, but I noticed not only were they well equipped, it's because they were all running drugs out of Lebanon, so they had money, but they were really good. And so I was talking to the PKK commander, and he said, oh, no, we won't accept anyone into the rebel movement until they've done their 2 years military service in the Turkish army. So what happened is that we lost control of our government. We lost control of our economy. And this isn't unique to the United States. Neoliberalism as an ideology essentially created this absurd notion that societies could advance themselves by kneeling before the dictates of the marketplace. This is popularized by figures like Thomas Friedman and others. It's an absolutely ridiculous political theory. It has no economic validity. In the, I don't know how many years of economic history, no society has benefited by allowing their oligarchic elite to become unregulated and uncontrolled and unfettered, but was peddled quite effectively by corporations beginning in the 1970s, reacting to the rise of movements in the 1960s, what the political scientist Samuel Huntington called America's quote-unquote excess of democracy. You had the Lewis Powell memo of 1971, which I'm sure you're aware of, which was the kind of blueprint that corporations used to roll back these movements and seize control of all of the institutions, and this goes back to the Kavanaugh issue, including the courts, academia. So if you weren't, especially in economics departments, or our greatest political philosopher who we lost a couple years ago, Sheldon Wolin, and read his book, Democracy Incorporated, a very important book for me in terms of giving me a language to describe the system. He describes the American system now as what he calls inverted totalitarianism. It's an important distinction from, let's say, fascism, because it's the primacy of economic profit over everything.
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. Sorry about my voice. Welcome back, brothers and sisters. I'm hoping that you are doing super great. From wherever you're watching me from, I'm your host and presenter, Junior Stories, and I hope that you are doing great. Now, Chris Hedges talks about American totalitarianism. For those who are hearing the term totalitarianism for the first time, totalitarianism is a political system in which the state holds authority over every aspect of public and private life. Unlike authoritarianism regimes that simply restrict political freedoms, totalitarianism seeks to control the minds, behaviors, beliefs, and values of their citizens. often through first, propaganda, two, surveillance, three, censorship, and four, state-sponsored violence. Now, usually, there are key characteristics of totalitarianism. The first one is absolute power, centralized control. The second one, third one is ideological dominance. The fourth one is propaganda and mass mobilization. The fifth one is suppression of dissent. The sixth one is surveillance and fear. The seventh one is cult of personality. Now, Chris Hedges says that America doesn't delineate from all these features. What does this mean? According to Chris Hedges, it means that this is the end game. This is where America ends because it at its stage of totalitarianism. Remember, it began with democracy, right? Going back down to the end of all these factors that we are seeing now. There's something really important that he talks about, and he talks about the rise of corporate totalitarianism, and this is why he warns the modern societies of the increasingly succumbing to form of corporate totalitarianism, which is an advanced, insidious system in which the mechanisms of the states serves the interest of private power, the oligarchs. Unlike classic forms of tyranny that rely on brute force, corporate totalitarianism operates under the guise of democracy and freedom. Through a sophisticated blend of surveillance, propaganda, and market manipulation and political co-optation, corporations now wield unprecedented control over public policy, economic life, media narratives, and even individual thought. Hedges argues that the system is not merely exploitative, but fundamentally authoritarian in nature. You'll agree with me, based on the things that are currently happening in the United States today, you realize that it matches all the features of totalitarianism, right? So some people call this oligarchy. Some people where the state power is working for the few private rich people who owns and controls factors of production, right? So I want to switch this video by Chris Hedges. All the description that he gives is a description of really a falling empire. And this is an aspect of totalitarianism that makes America itself shows a feature, just like Rome, a feature of a falling empire. So let's watch the video. I'll be back with my commentary as usual. If you're watching us for the first time, I'll definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. But until then, let's dive right into the video. I'll be back with my commentary.
Else, which isn't necessarily true in a fascist state, and that, like the late Roman Republic, as I said earlier, you maintain the facade, the electoral politics. I mean, this ridiculous hearing they had with Kavanaugh, as if everything wasn't preordained in advance. Everything becomes tribal. Truth no longer matters. The rights of the citizenry no longer matter. But the structures are there. Still, you still pay fealty to the Constitution and stuff. And yet inside the mechanisms of power, corporations control everything. And so you saw, well, I remember speaking to Wolin, and I did a 3-hour interview with him, which is on YouTube, which is right a year before he died. He was 92 or 93 then. And I had reread all his books. You can see I went in with legal pads full of notes, and it's remarkable. I mean, this guy, there was nothing I could throw at him. He hadn't been interviewed for over 10 years, and that was the last interview he gave. He was Cornel West's mentor. Cornell dedicated either his first or second book to Sheldon. And Wolin, in the 1980s, was one of those who called out neoliberalism for the con that it is. And he was immediately blacklisted. He's quite a good writer. Was quite a good writer. He used to write for the New York Review of Books. He was just purged. And he said that even at the end within the political science department at Princeton, where he was teaching, his own colleagues wouldn't speak to him. So all of those figures who could have warned us, Ralph Nader is another one, were shunted aside. Noam Chomsky, our greatest intellectual, hands down. A couple of years ago, I got a call from Noam. Of course, I've read Noam since, I don't know, I was 18 years old. And he said, I want you to write, I want to ask if you'll write the introduction to my new book. And so I hung up and I told my wife, I've arrived. That's it. I mean, my whole understanding of the mechanisms of the liberal class, I wrote a book called The Liberal Class, come out of Chomsky. I actually told Noam I should have put you down there. That whole idea of the liberal class not being the political left, that the liberal class functions as a kind of safety valve in moments of distress. And the reason in a capitalist democracy you tolerate the liberal class is because they set the parameters of acceptable debate. And as soon as critics on the left start attacking the structures or the motives of the ruling elites, the liberal class discredits them and pushes them aside. The liberal class can critique the excesses, but they never critique the system. And you see the classic example of how a liberal class is supposed to function in a capitalist democracy with the collapse of capitalism in the 1930s and Roosevelt. And Roosevelt's, after his death, they published his correspondence. I think his brother was the editor, which I've read. And it's fascinating because Roosevelt is keenly aware of the powerful movements, the Progressive Party, the labor unions like the CIO, but also the Communist Party, who we've kind of erased from our history, but it played an important role in American radicalism. And he says, if we don't respond, we'll get revolution and we'll lose everything. And so it was that pressure that led Roosevelt, who came from the oligarchic elite, to say, well, if the private sector can't create jobs, then the government will create jobs. And he creates 12 million jobs. Social Security. The unions in the wake of World War I had been decimated, destroyed, and the old United Mine Workers couldn't even exist legally until Roosevelt reversed it. So that's how a liberal class functions. And Roosevelt says his greatest achievement is that he saved capitalism, not democracy. He saved capitalism. But what happened after the war is there was an assault not only on those radical progressive movements that, as Howard Zinn has pointed out, opened up the space in our democracy. I mean, I always find it, and of course, what isn't today Columbus Day? Right. What? We should all be wearing black armbands. I was reading Eugene O'Neill's biography, who was quite a radical, and he said the only day in American history that he really cared about celebrating was the day the Sioux and the other tribes in the Little Bighorn wiped out the 7th Cavalry. That was really the only day he felt that. So, as Zinn understood, the system was created as a closed system. And you go back and read the Federalist Papers, and they were terrified of direct democracy. And they created all sorts of mechanisms, including the Electoral College, which has given us the gift of George W. Bush and Donald Trump. They created all sorts of mechanisms to thwart the ability of the populace, which they often conflated with the mob. So all of the spaces in American society were paid for with the blood of working men and women, African Americans, women in the suffragist movement, throughout American history. And this is why Zinn's book is important. I teach in a prison, and when you write up your proposal for your class, I teach through Rutgers, and they say they get their BA program. I taught Les Miserables last semester, and I put in a proposal to teach Gulag Archipelago next semester. I taught a class once called Conquest, and we read Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, which is a classic work on the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in human history. And Haiti's been paying for it ever since. And I was in Montana. I'd given them the syllabus. I said, well, I won't be here this week because I have to speak in Montana. And I was in my hotel room, in Montana, and I got a phone call, and it said, "This is a Special Investigations Division of the Department of Corrections of the state of New Jersey. Are you aware that your students just led a sit-down strike in the prison?" And it was very moving. I mean, I really was quite emotional when the phone call ended, because they knew even better than I did what would happen. Their cells would be strip searched, as they were. They would all be interrogated until they found the leaders of the strike, which they did, and those leaders would be shipped to another prison and put in indefinite solitary confinement, where they remain. And yet they rose up anyway. And we just, of course, saw heroic struggle on the part of incarcerated men and women, which ended on September 9th, the anniversary of the 47th anniversary of the Attica prison uprising. If you haven't read Heather Thompson's Blood on the Water, read it. It is a really amazing work of the history of the Attica uprising, but more importantly, how after that uprising, the power elites effectively demonized African Americans, I mean, because they were so frightened. When that action that just finished on September 9th was concluded, you had seen throughout the country thousands of men and women who had carried out work stoppages. It didn't get the kind of press coverage it should, commissary boycotts and hunger strikes, because they grasped, and I think it's an important lesson for all of us, that our system is so calcified that reform will not come from within. It will only come from without. And as the Free Alabama, I don't know if you know about the Free Alabama movement, they did a work stoppage 2010, and then they put the leaders again in indefinite solitary confinement. But Alabama being Alabama, where the guards make minimum wage, it means you can get anything. So they call me on their cell phones all the time, which you're not supposed to have. But they said, you know, the only way to end slavery, which is neo-slavery, which it is in our prisons, is to stop being a slave. That the only mechanism we have now is to break them economically. If you paid prisoners the minimum wage, our entire prison system would collapse. It can't be sustained. Prisoners in Louisiana make 4 cents an hour. I guess if you're really at the high end, you can fight fires in California for $1 an hour. New Jersey, they make 22 cents an hour. That's $28 a month. I've got students who, spend 20, 30, 40 years in prison, work 40-hour weeks, get out, and not only do they not have Social Security, they're in debt. Because now you get in debt in prison. So I think that on, people who come out of marginal communities, I certainly find my students in the prison have a kind of hyper-awareness of the fact that we live in a failed democracy, that our democracy is not a functioning democracy, and that by appealing to those institutions, and this was both mine and Shama Sawan's problem with Sanders. We did an event with Bernie and Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein the night before the climate march in New York, and Shama kept pushing Bernie not to run as a Democrat. And I found Bernie's answer quite illuminating, because he said, well, if I do that, I'll end up like Ralph Nader. And he's not wrong. What he was saying is that if I defy the Democratic Party establishment, they will destroy me. And the tragedy for me of the Sanders campaign is, one, which turned out to be true, I never believed that the Democratic Party was going to ever permit Bernie to get the nomination, and I think we now have enough cumulative evidence to say that it was stolen from him. And secondly, we're never going to build a resistance movement within the span of an election cycle. And we're going to have to walk out into the wilderness for a long time. Syriza, which governs Greece, and yes, I know about Cyprus caving into the banks, but Syriza was polling at 4% 10 years ago. We're going to have to go back and do that hard kind of work. I was going to tell that Zinn story. So one of my great coups in the prison, so when I write the description of the course, it's the opposite from writing for a college audience where, class on the lawn, lots of films. You got to make it sound absolutely as boring and turgid as possible. So I submitted a proposal to teach American history and the three branches of government and Constitution, which got passed because it goes through Rutgers, then it goes through the prison administration. And then I brought in the People's History of the United States for all of my students. It was quite moving. I mean, most all of them are black. And Zinn is quite cognizant throughout that whole book of the story of African Americans. And these guys, their minds were blown away. But I would be giving my 90-minute talk on whatever chapter we were on, Reconstruction or something, and I would hear students go, damn, we've been lied to. And they have been lied to. So we saw that period in the 70s where corporations organized a frontal assault against every institution that made democratic space possible, that made the mechanisms of reform possible, that gave a voice to the citizenry and critics of imperialism, critics of capitalism. And it closed and closed and closed. At the same time that the economy was reconfigured, and we shifted, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, from what he called an empire of production to an empire of consumption, meaning that we were borrowing to maintain both an empire and a lifestyle we could no longer afford. I don't know if you saw the New York Times story a few days ago on the explosion of government debt, of the U.S. debt. It was quite chilling. It was a front page story. And it was, of course, with the tax cuts, over a 10-year period, we will diminish an estimated $1.5 trillion from government revenue. Next year, we're on track to pay about $370 billion of interest. And in 10 years, we will be paying $900 billion a year in interest. It's not a sustainable system. But, of course, there is a handful of people on Wall Street and in criminal organizations like Goldman Sachs who are doing extremely well. I've taught 3 times at Princeton, and I remember when they had a small Occupy gathering at Princeton, and they asked me to come speak to them, and I did. What I didn't know is that there was a reporter from the Daily Princetonian in the crowd, and the next day the school paper said, Ferris professor announces, I was quoted correctly, Ferris professor announces that the president of Princeton and other elite universities are just overcompensated fundraisers. Princeton students are far too deferential to authority, and half of the Princeton trustee board should be in prison. I wasn't invited back next year. I actually got an email that day. I think they wanted it clear that they'd read the story. But of course it's true. I mean, Princeton is just a corporation, like most of these universities. Harvard, the same. They produce systems managers. The largest major at both Harvard and Princeton is computer science. The humanities are withering away. All of those mechanisms that teach us not what to think, but how to think. I mean, they're not wrong that an education is subversive. It's designed to make you ask questions. But the system only wants people who will perpetuate it. So you get the 2008 financial crash, and the systems managers loot the U.S. Treasury to reinflate a failed financial system. The University of Missouri just recently went and tried to estimate the exact amount of money the Fed had fabricated, and they came up with $26 trillion. Trillion dollars. I mean, imagine. Now, China's response to 2008 was very different from our own. It was about kind of like the New Deal. They had infrastructure projects and all, put people to work. $26 trillion were handed to people who should be in prison, unlike my students. And what did they do with it? Well, they, as they've done with the tax cuts, they bought back their own stock. And you know, this idea that an overheated stock market is good for the economy, I just want to give everybody copies of John Kenneth Galbraith's The Crash. It's insane. It's not tied to value. Of course, they're buying back their own stock. Apple bought back 100, I think I have that right, 100 million of their own stock, something like that, because all the CEOs' compensation packages are tied to it. So they're even cheating their own stockholders ultimately. So what do they do with the money? They hoard it. I mean, it's borrowed money. It's borrowed at virtually 0% interest, and central banks in Europe were lending money out at negative interest rates, which meant they actually gave you, if you borrowed money, they give you money. What did they do with the money? They bought back their own stock, which swelled their compensation packages. They hoarded it, or they gambled. For instance, and there was another article in the Times. I read other papers besides the Times, but there was an article in the Times in the Week in Review about 2 or 3 weeks ago where they talked about the fracking industry being the next dot-com bubble, because the fracking industry loses money. It's valued on projected profit, just like the dot-com industry, not actual profit. They've already swallowed about $280 billion. So what you've done is there's no use of that money, which of course, I mean, the tragedy is that, you know, every student in this country could go to college for free. We would have a rational healthcare system where we weren't preyed upon by pharmaceutical and insurance companies. 18% of GDP, the least efficient health care service in the industrialized world. And even if you have insurance, your costs and co-pays and everything is imploding because they can. 1 million people a year go bankrupt because corporations have the ability to hold their sick children hostage while they bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughter. I mean, it's an utterly insane system. All of this could have been fixed, but it wasn't. And of course, the problem is that it has to be paid back. And so what they are doing is extracting from us. That's student debt, $1.5 trillion, and it's estimated that within 2 decades or so, 40% of those who have student debt will go into default. Personal debt is $13 billion. I mean, American production since 1973 has gone up by 77%. And if wages had kept pace with production, the minimum wage would be well over $20 an hour. 41 million workers in this country, a third of the workforce, earn less than $12 an hour, and almost none of them have employee-sponsored health insurance. But that's by design, because they need to suppress wages in order to extract debt. And I opened the book in Scranton, Pennsylvania. The moment the city is facing insolvency, so everyone in the city has been put on minimum wage, including the mayor. What happened, their pension funds were decimated in 2008, lost 40% of their value because of financial fraud, and they're selling off their city assets. They're selling off their sewer system, their parking authority, all of their utilities, in a desperate effort to regain financial solvency. And of course, these corporations come in and then jack up the prices. Double, triple the prices. And the per capita income in Scranton is $45,000 a year. But the question is, what happens when they don't have any assets to sell off? And this is described quite effectively by Marx when he writes about the late stage of capitalism. He said and Karl Polanyi is the other writer that captured this in his book, The Great Transformation, that when you have unfettered, unregulated capitalism, corporate capitalism, that it has the capacity to commodify everything. Human beings become commodities, the natural world becomes a commodity that it then exploits until exhaustion or collapse. And that's, of course, what we're seeing in this insane inability to respond to the ecocide. You've all seen the report that came out yesterday, which says basically we have 10 years to save ourselves as a species. That's it. And the reason that climate scientists are so terrified, they're talking about 1.5 Celsius, the reason they're so terrified of going beyond 2 degrees Celsius is because of feedback loops, which means that essentially you lose the ability to control. So your temperatures rise, your ice cap, the polar ice caps melt, and once they're gone, they're not coming back for thousands of years. The acidification in the oceans, I mean, that you can't control it. The one plays off of the other. And we know what feedback loops do because they've studied it on planets like Venus, which used to have water and is now 800 degrees. That's where we're headed. But we've retreated into what anthropologists would call crisis cults, magical thinking. So the seizure of power by these elites, the primacy of profit, the destruction of democratic institutions, including the courts, really, and you are going to watch now with Kavanaugh some very, what they do, what they've been doing, but it will be accelerated, is they are taking from us our constitutional rights by judicial fiat, i.e. reinterpreting the right of unlimited corporate power through a distorted interpretation of the Constitution. How do they justify Citizens United?
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching me from. I'm your host and presenter, Generic Stories. Now, let's get to the business. When I talk about totalitarianism, remember this happens in the suffering of democracy. And this leads to the erosion of democratic institutions. A central concern in Edge's analysis is the hollowing out of democratic institutions. He noticed that electoral systems, legislatures, and regulatory agencies have become shells, performing rituals of democracy while serving corporate masters. Politicians across the political spectrum are beholden to campaign donors from the financial, pharmaceutical, energy, and defense sectors. Legislative agendas are dictated by lobbyists. Our regulatory bodies are captured through revolving doors between government and industries. The result is a pseudo-democracy where the people vote, but real power remains in the hands of elite economic interests, the oligarchs. It is true, they have the factors. They own and control the factors of production. They have the power to manipulate the government, to use things against the government. And so they get this leverage against the mass population. And what does this do to democracy? Because democracy is the rule of the people, for the people, and by the people. Now, all these decisions are not going to be made by the citizens. The decision is going to be made by the few political elites who run and owns the factors of production. I'm also going to be talking about manufactured content and media propaganda as one of the talking points. And Chris Edges draws from Edward Bernays and Noam Chomsky, where he explains how corporate media functions to manufacture content rather than informing its citizens. The media no longer holds power accountable. Instead, it distracts, it distorts, it disseminates corporate ideology. Celebrity, gossip, consumer culture, partisan theatrics replace investigative journalism. And civic engagement. New organizations owned by conglomerates act as public relation arms of the elite, normalizing inequality, justifying endless war, and silencing dissenting voices. This engineered ignorance sustains the illusion of freedom while reinforcing hegemonic control. This is what is also called hegemony, right? Now, let's talk about the spectacle of illusion. Most of the time under oligarchy, all these countries that are going through totalitarianism, They usually have this one feature which is called the spectacle of illusion. Now, Edges also really emphasizes on this, that he emphasizes that corporate totalitarianism relies on spectacle, a term borrowed by Guy Debord, to divert attention from systemic decay through endless streams of entertainment, sports, pornography, social media, and consumerism. People are kept in a state of distraction. These spectacles pacify dissent and mask the absence of substantive democratic choice. A civic life deteriorates. Citizens retreat into digital realms and fantasy cultures that provide emotional stimulation but not material empowerment. The culture of distraction is a hallmark of authoritarian turn. Also goes ahead and talks about economic servitude and neoliberal exploitation. Economically, Chris Edges argues that neoliberalism, the ideology backbone of corporate totalitarianism, has transformed citizens into debtors and workers into expendable units. Wages have stagnated, unions have been dismantled, labor protections eroded, all while wealth concentrates at the top 1%. Corporations externalize costs, exploit global labor markets, and prioritize essential services like water, education, and healthcare. Neoliberalism enforces austerity for the masses and unlimited growth for capital. Remember, in such systems, poverty is pathologized, not addressed, and wealth becomes a tool for domination, not investment in the common good. Right. We also get to talk about the criminalization of dissent. Another dimension of corporate totalitarianism is the criminalization of dissent. Whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning are vilified or imprisoned, while activists are labeled as threats to national security. Laws such as the Patriotic Act, the Espionage Act, and anti-protest ordinances are used to suppress movements that challenge corporate hegemony. Surveillance technologies developed under the guise of security are deployed to monitor, intimidate, and to disrupt political oppositions. Edges argues that the machinery of repression is expanding precisely because ruling elites are aware of the growing illegitimacy. Right? Talk about ecological devastation and corporate impunity. Edges also links corporate totalitarianism to environmental collapse. Corporations, particularly in the fossil fuel and agrochemical sectors, pursue profit with complete disregard for ecological consequences. Climate change, deforestation, ocean acidification, and species extinction are treated as collateral damage. Regulatory bodies are powerless and complicit, and scientific warnings are dismissed or suppressed. The planetary crisis is not merely environmental, it is political and moral. A system that prioritizes shareholder returns over planetary survival. Edges argues this is not irrational, it is suicidal for the United States. He also talks about the myth of progress and technological fetishism. A particularly incisive part of Edges critiques lies in his rejection of the myth of linear progress. In a corporate-dominated society, technology is often portrayed as a neutral force that will solve social problems. But Edges caution that technology, when controlled by monopolistic entities, becomes a tool of exploitation and surveillance, or algorithmic policing. Technological advancement serves capital, not humanity. The fetishization of innovation blinds society to its ethical costs and displaces responsibility for structural reform. We also get to listen collapse of empathy and cultural degeneration. Edges contends that corporate totalitarianism has also triggered moral and cultural decline. As profit becomes the ultimate metric of value, empathy, community, and human dignity are subordinate. Literature, philosophy, and critical thinking are devalued in favor of marketable skills and vocational obedience. Education is transformed into job training, and art is stripped of its submissive potential. This degeneration of culture undermines the capacity for resistance by eroding the moral imagination necessary to envision alternative futures. Get to talk about the resistance as moral imperative. Despite the bleak landscape, Edis maintains that resistance, through difficult and often without immediate reward, is a moral imperative. Drawing from figures like Václav Havel, Hannah Arendt, and James Baldwin, he argues that dissent is not about winning, but about bearing witness to the truth. Resistance affirms that sanctity of conscience is an edge of cynicism. It may not dismantle the system overnight, but it preserves human dignity, fosters solidarity, and plants the seed for revolutionary change. The act of resistance becomes a form of spiritual and political defiance. I'm your host and presenter, Jintok Stories. I'm hoping that you're fine from wherever you're watching me. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.